الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode of Quran Circle 11, where we listen to recitation of the Quran to perfect our recitation and reflecting upon the meanings of these verses, choosing a topic or the verses that talks or mentions women in these verses so that we can reflect more into specifically the subject, to witness the miraculous nature of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that it covers all matters that is needed for people to establish the purpose of their life. And the fact of the matter is that we as Muslims, we don't have any issues with it, as clearly stated in the Quran. There's no differences when it comes to the responsibilities. There's no superiority that makes someone inferior or someone that is in state of humiliation of the other. All of the human beings are creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both men and women. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created them. He's the one that created them. So no one is to object to the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to fulfill the commands of Allah with the dual responsibilities upon each and every one of them. And some of the rulings that is unique for women versus men and men versus women, to establish again this perfect way of life, fulfilling the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is based on justice and mercy and the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are still in Surah Maryam, but we'll take one portion from Surah Maryam and then Surah Taha and then Surah Al-Anbiya. And in Surah Maryam, it's titled Maryam, which is one again of the greatest women ever created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As we know, Maryam alayhi salam and Khadija and Aisha and Fatima and Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun, as the Prophet ﷺ stated in the authentic hadith. So we'll start inshallah ta'ala with Surah Maryam, verse number 27, continuing with what we did previously in the previous episode. But before we do that, I would like to introduce the reciters with us today. We have Sheikh As'ad Al-Hawi, welcome to the program, barakallahu feekum. And Sheikh Ayman Abdul Mun'im, welcome to the program. And Sheikh Abdul Khaliq Atiyah, barakallahu feekum. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make our environments always blessed with the book of Allah. So we'll start inshallah ta'ala with Surah Maryam. Surah Maryam, verses 27 to verse number 36. And Sheikh As'ad, go ahead and recite for us inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم فأتت به قومها تحمله قالوا يا مريم لقد جئت شيئا فريا يا أخت هارون ما كان أبوك امرأ سوء وما كانت أمك بغيا فأشارت إليه قالوا كيف نكلم من كان في المهد صبيا قال إني عبد الله آتاني الكتاب وجعلني نبيا وجعلني مباركا أينما كنت وأوصاني بالصلاة والزكاة ما دمت حيا وبرا بوالدتي ولم يجعلني جبارا شقيا والسلام علي يوم ولدت ويوم أموت ويوم أبعث حيا ذلك عيسى ابن مريم قول الحق الذي فيه يمترون ما كان لله أن يتخذ من ولد سبحانه إذا قضى أمرا فإنما يقول له كن فيكون وإن الله ربي وربكم فاعبدوه هذا صراط مستقيم.
MashaAllah, Rabbana barak feek. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. And this is a continuation of what we did in the previous episode, because we heard the recitation of the verses just right before that. So when Maryam, she brought Isa alayhi salam with her after she gave birth to him, and the people, of course, they were shocked. How can she have a child without being married? And they said, calling her and asking her that your father was not an evil man, neither your mother. She was not someone that you would get this from her. They were righteous people, so how dare you do something like this, more or less of the meaning. So since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded Maryam alayhi salam to be silent and to say that I'm fasting, meaning fasting from speaking, as it's one of the ways of fasting that used to be before. So when she pointed at her son and she did not say anything, so they said, how can we speak to a child in the cradle? That this is something that, of course, it's obvious that he does not speak. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Isa alayhi salam the ability to speak, and that's a miraculous thing. And what he said by itself is a sign that he's innocent of any evil actions, and plus to declare the fact that he is a slave of Allah. Because the ayah, as it says, verse number 30, he says, Inni abdullah. He said, I am indeed the slave of Allah, the servant of Allah. He gave me the book and he made me a prophet. So from the very beginning, the moment that he was born, and this is something that can never be hidden because it's a miraculous thing. So he declared the matter very clear. And when we talk about Maryam alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved her because of how she was devoted to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides and helps the believers when they are devoted in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So she was made very clearly that she is innocent of such an evil crime. And Isa alayhi salam, he said about himself that he's blessed wherever he go, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded him to establish the salah and to give the zakah as long as he's alive, and to be kind and righteous to his mother, which is another thing that we would see throughout the entire Quran. And this is, of course, the subject of women, that women as a mother in the state of Islam is such an important position. And how many times we are commanded to be righteous and kind to the parents, but the mother specifically. And this is something that, as the Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked 3 times, who among the people has the right for my companionship? He said, your mother. Then he was asked again, he said, your mother. Then he was asked again, then he said, your mother. And then in the 4th time, he said, your father, which shows the level of virtue that the mothers, they carry in the deen of Islam. And this is by itself is a level of virtue that the sons and daughters are commanded to be extremely kind and righteous towards their parents, especially the mother. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned about Isa alayhi salam, and this is the speech of the truth. And it does not befit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take a son. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of the heavens and earth. He is in no need of having a son. This is something that people made up, fabricated. This is not something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed whether to Isa alayhi salam or any of the revelation of Allah. This is something that is made up by the people, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is able to do all things. If He decree a matter, He says for it to be, and it becomes. And indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Lord of everyone. And He said that Isa alayhi salam, my Lord and your Lord. So worship Him. This is the straight path that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to be upon. Going to the next surah, Surah Taha, and verses 36 to 41. 36 to 41 in Surah Taha. And Sheikh Ayman, go ahead and recite for us, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. قال قد أوتيت سؤلك يا موسى ولقد مننا عليك مرة أخرى إذ أوحينا إلى أمك ما يوحى أن اقذفيه في التابوت فاقذفيه في اليم فليلقه اليم بالساحل يأخذه عدو لي وعدو له وألقيت عليك محبة مني ولتصنع على عيني إذ تمشي أختك فتقول هل أدلكم على من يكفله فرجعناك إلى أمك كي تقر عينها ولا تحزن وقتلت نفسا فنجيناك من الغم وفتناك فتونا فلبثت سنين في أهل مدين ثم جئت على قدر يا موسى واصطنعتك لنفسي.
بارك الله فيك. جزاكم الله خيرا. Surah Taha, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the story of Musa alayhi salam, and in it the mention of the mother of Musa alayhi salam and his sister, and how they had a big role in the life of Musa alayhi salam, and the level of iman, the level of faith, the level of devotion, the level of tawakkul, relying upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had in his mother. It's such an amazing thing. And this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned as a favor and a bounty from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He bestowed upon Musa alayhi salam. So as a result of having such a mother, when she was inspired to throw and to cast her son into a box into the water, when she feared for her son that he is going to be killed, as Fir'aun was going after the newly born children to kill the males among them from the people of Bani Israel. And this was the year that he commanded for something like that to happen, and this is the year where Musa alayhi salam was born. So out of the fear for her son, she didn't know what to do, and she was inspired to throw him into the river. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected his messenger alayhi salam. And people need to understand from this that the mother of Musa was tested, but this was an inspiration from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of the heavens and the earth. So if He commands something, never to think that this command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring something of misery to you. If you submit yourself to the command of Allah, if you do it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, the entire universe will be under your service, if it's correct to say, for the sake of Allah, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a matter to be decreed. So if we really, as believers, if we really perfect this, this is a great benefit. This is a lifetime change if a person really comprehend these meanings. And we learned that from the mother of Musa alayhi salam. And that is, if it's a wahy from Allah, if it's a revelation from Allah, this is what comes first, and not the physical means. The physical means are to be taken, but if there is a revelation from Allah, don't look into the physical means, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of all things, one of which the physical means, because it's meant for us to know these things, to understand. She cast him into the river, which is basically, according to the physical means, this is a definite death for her son, but this is an inspiration from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will protect him. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did. And then not just that, but for that box or whatever means that he was put in, that by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to go to the same house of Fir'aun that was going after Musa alayhi salam, to go to his house, and for the love of Musa alayhi salam to be in the heart of the wife of Fir'aun. And not just that, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would make every single woman that would offer to breastfeed this child that is in the palace of Fir'aun, and then she would get all kinds of good things as a result of that. All of them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by His decree, they would not be able to do so, and He would not accept their breast for breastfeeding except His own mother. And that's why the sister of Musa alayhi salam when his mother told her to go and to find and to look what happened to Musa alayhi salam. And she spoke to the people of Fir'aun that I know someone that can take care of him. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala returned Musa alayhi salam to his mother again for her to have the comfort of her eye and not to be in state of grief. So see here how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala honored the mother of Musa by making her put her trust in Allah, which is the highest level that a human being can be in. And this is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a favor upon the mother of Musa, honoring the mother of Musa by relying upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that she gets great rewards from Allah. And as a result of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave her comfort and made her not to grieve, and to honor her that she would breastfeed her child with the protection of Fir'aun himself and not fearing any harm to her son, and she would even get wages for this as a result of that. So therefore the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no one can oppose this whatsoever. And this was in the context of mentioning some of the favors of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon Musa alayhi salam, and one of which is when he killed one of the people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved them, and he stayed for years among the people of Madyan. Then he came back, and when he was coming back, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to him to convey the message to Fir'aun. And the beautiful statement was طَنَعْتُكَ لِنَفْسِي, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose Musa alayhi salam to be in such a position and tested him. And you see all of this is with Musa alayhi salam and the role of his mother and his sister, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned. We'll go to the next surah inshallah ta'ala, which is Surah Al-Anbiya. Surah Al-Anbiya, and verses 83 to verse number 92. And Sheikh Abdul Khaliq, please go ahead and recite for us inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. وأيوب إذ نادى ربه أني مسني الضر وأنت أرحم الراحمين فاستجبنا له فكشفنا ما به من ضر وآتيناه أهله ومثلهم معهم رحمة من عندنا وذكرى للعابدين وإسماعيل وإدريس وذا الكفل كل من الصابرين وأدخلناهم في رحمتنا إنهم من الصالحين وذا النون إذ ذهب مغاضبا فظن أن لن نقدر عليه فنادى في الظلمات أن لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين فنادى في الظلمات أن لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين فاستجبنا له ونجيناه من الغم وكذلك ننجي المؤمنين وزكريا إذ نادى ربه رب لا تذرني فردا وأنت خير الوارثين فاستجبنا له ووهبنا له يحيى وأصلحنا له زوجه إنهم كانوا يسارعون في الخيرات ويدعوننا رغبا ورهبا إنهم كانوا يسارعون في الخيرات ويدعوننا رغبا ورهبا وكانوا لنا خاشعين والتي أحصنت فرجها فنفخنا فيها من روحنا وجعلناها وابنها آية والتي أحصنت فرجها فنفخنا فيها من روحنا وجعلناها وابنها آية للعالمين إن هذه أمتكم أمة واحدة وأنا ربكم فاعبدون.
MashaAllah. ربنا يبارك فيك. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you. And this set of prophets of Allah, messengers of Allah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent, and as the Surah Al-Anbiya, the Surah of prophets, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned them and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made them so virtue and their superiority in their devotion and their obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected them and honored them. And what's mentioned here in these verses of how the prophets of Allah, they had wives, they were married, they had children, and how their wives played a huge role in their life, one of which is Ayub alayhi salam, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tested him with a very severe sickness in his skin, as it's mentioned. And just the fact that it's mentioned in the verse that he invoked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that harm had afflicted him. And you are the most merciful, O Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted his dua and relieved him from such harm, and his family and the like of them returned to him. And it was said that everyone stayed away from him. He was afflicted by a disease in his skin, whether it's leprosy or something else, that people would run away from him, except his wife. Except his wife, it was said that she would take care of her husband and she would serve her husband. And she was to the extent of which, as it's mentioned in the books of the Tafsir, that she did not have any means after she severed all the means, that she would go and serve people for money to take care of her husband, which is a lesson for us to learn, and how the role of the wife to be as support to her husband and to protect her, seeking the help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to serve her husband and to be there for him. And also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he mentioned the prophets of Allah, and in other parts of the Quran, when it talked about Ismail alayhi salam and how he also with his spouse and how they were obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet Yunus is mentioned and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved him when he was in the middle of the darkness of the fish and the darkness of the sea and the darkness of the night, when he called upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and he said, La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu min al-zalimin. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepted his dua and saved them from such a distress. And the same way is repeated for the believers if they would invoke Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with such a dua, with such sincerity. Zakaria alayhi salam is mentioned, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned his favor upon him, that he gave him Yahya as a son after he was in old age, and after his mother or his wife being old and barren, not able to give birth. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by his power, let her have birth to Yahya. And then the point here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rectified his wife for him. Whether the meaning of it, that means he fixed her in a way that she would be able to be pregnant and to give birth, which is one of the correct meaning, and also rectified her, that means to make her righteous as a result of her husband being righteous, which is another point. If you want your spouse to be righteous, be yourself righteous. Don't ask for them to be righteous and you're not. So if you are yourself righteous and devoted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can bestow his favor upon you by rectifying and making righteous those who are close to you. And then how they were righteous and devoted in worship, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّهُمْ كَانُوا يُسَارِعُونَ فِي الْخَيْرَاتِ وَيَدْعُونَنَا رَغَبًا وَرَهَبًا وَكَانُوا لَنَا خَاشِعِينَ. Three things. They used to be in haste when it comes to good deeds. They're in haste to do good deeds. And this is how the families would be blessed, both husband and wife and the women and men, to be in haste, always competing to do good deeds. And they would invoke and make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeking things from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and out of the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they were humble to Allah, humbled in their worship, humbled in their submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised them in the Quran. And also Maryam alayhi salam is mentioned, how she honored and protected her chastity. And as a result of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made her have a miraculous birth to her son, that He made them as a sign to the people, those who existed in their time. All of these are the ones mentioned before. This is one ummah, this is one nation, this is your nation, the nation of the Muslimin, those who submitted themselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's the same nation when it comes to their belief, their devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we are commanded to follow their example. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the Lord of all, so therefore worship Him alone. So if the word that we can get that would bring all of these blessings, and what's mentioned about women in these verses and the wives of the prophets and so on, it's not because of the fact that they're wives of the prophets and that's it, because we know that what happened to the wife of Lut, for example, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punished her. But it's all about fa'budun, worship me. Worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, devoted in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is then all kinds of blessings and mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that a person will be immersed in. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among those who are blessed and to bless our families and our children. And before we end, I would like to thank the reciters. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for the beautiful recitation. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept and make us all among the people of the Quran. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
الله نزل أحسن الحديث كتابا متشابها مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم مثانية تقشعر منه جلود الذين يخشون ربهم ثم تلين جلودهم وقلوبهم